Let's resume the meeting. The next item is proposed by the Government Secretariat, Financial Services and the Treasury Bureau, Treasury Branch, and they'd like to create 2 permanent posts. That is under the FSTB and AO staff grade CD2 to enhance the support for the government in the taxation matters, and also another chief assessor, which is a D1 post. It will be created from switch from a supernumerary post to a permanent post to deal with the relevant stamp duty matters. The government consulted the Financial Affairs panel on the 3rd of January 2017. We have from the FSTB Deputy Secretary for Financial Services and the Treasury, Mr. Andrew Lai, and Ms. Pak Lin Yong, PAS for FST, and Mr. Tem Tai Pang, Deputy Commissioner of Inland Revenue. Mr. Christopher Cheung, Chairman of the Financial Affairs panel, is not a member of this subcommittee, and he will not attend today's meeting. So I'm going to give some salient points of the deliberations of the panel. According to the paper, the FA panel discussed the proposal on the 3rd of January 2017. Members do not object to the proposal. Some members are concerned that creating a AOSGC under the FSTB will bring economic benefits for Hong Kong. According to the administration, in recent years, international taxation cooperation has been developing rapidly, and the OECD has on a regular basis proposed new measures to enhance taxation transparency and to combat the tax evasion across the border. There is an urgent need for the FSTB to increase manpower to deal with this matter so as to avoid being labeled a non-cooperative taxation jurisdiction and affect the reputation and status of Hong Kong as an international financial center. Dr. Kwokaki, questions? Thank you, Madam Chair. About the 2 posts, I support them, but I have some questions. First, in para 4 of the paper, according in relation to the AEOI, Automatic Exchange of Financial Account Information and Tax Matters, and tackling base erosion and profit shifting of enterprises, we understand that tax evasion and corruption in China is very serious. About the tax jurisdictions which we have established liaisons, do we have any exchange of information mechanism with the mainland to tackle the problem of corrupt officials from the mainland sending money to Hong Kong? Do we have this policy? Second point, I also requested the IRD to investigate the incumbent chief executive, Mr. C.Y. Leung, in relation to the UGL case about extraterrestrial taxation. So far, I haven't heard a reply. And we've all heard about litigation initiated by C.Y. Leung himself. Now, the chief executive may be involved in tax evasion, and are you subject to pressure such that you are not working full steam in your investigation process? Otherwise, how come, despite the incident having happened a long time, I still haven't heard an answer from you? And about the $50 million pocketed by C.Y. Leung from UGL, I want to know whether any tax evasion is involved. This is very important because we have the rule of law in Hong Kong, and we attach great importance to the integrity of government officials. And this is also the duty of the IRD. And yet, in this incident, the IRD has been keeping very quiet. If a senior government official or chief executive is involved in a tax scandal, you're going to put up with it. If that is the case, we find this unacceptable. Please answer why we haven't heard from you for several years. Deputy Secretary, Mr. Lai. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Dr. Kwok, for supporting the proposal to create these two posts. On these two questions, first, on automatic exchange of taxation information, this is pursuant to the proposal put forward by the OECD in 2014. We have over 100 jurisdictions joining the arrangement, including advanced economies and Hong Kong, as well as mainland China. After joining the AEOI mechanism, we are required to sign agreements with individual jurisdictions before the AEOI can be initiated. And we have signed agreements with 11 jurisdictions so far, and we can begin the automatic exchange of information in 2018 earliest. As for the bilateral agreement signed with the 11 tax jurisdictions, mainland China so far is not included, and we can also commence negotiation with mainland China on the AEOI mechanism. To address Dr. Kwok's concerns, in recent years there have been strengthened international tax cooperation. We would like to combat unlawful activities as well as preventing tax evasion. Several years ago, on automatic exchange of information in terms of counter-terrorist financing and also other combating measures, Hong Kong has taken part in them. Dr. Kwok mentioned a case specifically, and please understand that according to the Inland Revenue Ordinance, the IRD cannot disclose the details of any particular individual, so I'm afraid I am not in a position to disclose any details about the case itself. Well, I understand, of course, you cannot say anything about the case, but about the IRD's position, do you understand that it affects the public's confidence in the IRD or even the whole government? Are you aware of that? You can answer no. Any comment? Just very briefly. The IRD has a professional team to deal with each and every case, and in this case, I have not participated in it. What about officials from the IRD? Are you affected? This is our concern. Mr. Tam. Whenever we receive a complaint, we follow the established procedures in handling the complaint, and we will not disclose the action taken by us or the outcome. This is according to the secrecy provision in Section 4 of the Inland Revenue Ordinance, and this applies to each and every case. As we always emphasize, we have a high degree of confidentiality in handling taxation cases. I think that the public will understand this. Another question, and that's my turn. Deputy Secretary, on the 3rd of January, the FA panel discussed this proposal, and I wasn't present because I was unable to attend the meeting. And some members have commented that by creating this post on international taxation cooperation can bring benefits to Hong Kong. But I have heard otherwise from the banking sector. For example, they suggest that these posts are created to collect tax from on others' behalf. And some smaller banks have told me that for clients with dual nationality, they would just turn down the request to take up a business because the compliance cost would be so huge. You have meetings with other jurisdictions and you've undertaken to implement these initiatives. Of course, you're being compliant, but I understand that for Singapore, they know how to cut corners and do more business. I think that we are paying a huge cost to comply with the international regulations. Thank you for your question. Well, in recent years, there have been enhanced international taxation cooperation. Say, for example, for this EOI, 101 jurisdictions around the world have taken part in this arrangement. This is driven by the OECD, and against this backdrop, Hong Kong is an international financial center, and it is hard to say no to these initiatives, and it is not really up to us not to participate in these initiatives. The OECD requires its members to take part in the initiatives, and they would also regularly review and assess how the initiative is implemented. If some jurisdictions are slow in taking up the initiative, for example, for the OECD, it was announced last year that starting from the middle of this year, they will conduct a review to look at the implementation progress of the 101 jurisdictions, and that if the initiative is not implemented properly, they may consider the jurisdiction to be non-cooperative tax jurisdiction, which may result in sanction on the part of the non-cooperative jurisdiction. As such, we feel pressured to participate in the international cooperative initiative, and as mentioned just now, 101 advanced economies around the world have taken part in it. So it's not really an option. We are required to take part in it. And we understand that for financial institutions, they have that there is compliance implications on their part, and we therefore also try to minimize the compliance requirements. We only require them to adhere to the reporting standards. We do not have additional requirements on them, be it Singapore or the United States. When they implement the AEOI, then the information to be provided and information to be collected will be the same. Well, please just tell me, for Singapore, can you tell me something about the compliance? What about their progress? I think that Singapore is making greater progress than Hong Kong, because at present we have only signed the agreement, bilateral AEOI agreements with 11 jurisdictions. As of last month, Singapore has already signed agreements with 22 jurisdictions. The OECD has commented on our slow progress, in fact. Well, they may have signed the agreement, but have they enacted the legislation? Well, the principal legislation that allows them to exchange information with other jurisdictions was passed at the end of last year. So you're going to conduct follow-up work, say, to conduct a survey on banks to see whether there is any increase in manpower in the compliance department, whether they have taken up more businesses, and whether there is any impact on the reputation and status of Hong Kong. Would you ask the Hong Kong MA to do that? Thank you, Madam Chair. We're concerned about the impact on the financial services industry and their operations. In fact, I met with representatives of the Hong Kong Association of Banks on this matter. This may pose additional workload on them, but they understand that this is the international obligation, and they also understand that if the OECD regards us as a non-cooperative tax jurisdiction because of our slow progress, then we should expedite the progress to meet that requirement. Mr. Leung Kwok Hong. Well, we signed bilateral agreements with 11 jurisdictions. Can you tell us which ones? Do you have that list? Well, I'll see if Mr. Leung Kwok Hong has other questions before I reply in one go. Let's say if you have 11 tax jurisdictions, I think the important question is which 11? Starting from the end of last year, the IRD has been working hard in negotiating with the tax jurisdictions which have signed the CDTA, in signing AOEI, and we have signed with Belgium, Canada, Guernsey, Mexico, Japan, Netherlands, South Africa, UK. So, but basically countries from the European Union. Why not mainland China? We're so close. We have frequent exchanges. Why not? What's the obstacle? We're from the same route. It only takes an hour to travel to China with XRL. Thank you, Mr. Leung Kwok-hong, for your question. So far, apart from 11 agreements signed, the IRD has also initiated negotiation with a lot of jurisdictions, including the mainland. Yes, including the mainland. So the mainland is one of the prospective jurisdictions, while UK and Japan, of course, are very important. When will you complete the deal with the mainland? I don't think it will take long, because the OECD would like to see that we can commence exchange of information with most jurisdictions next year. Now, in relation to AOI arrangements, I think one issue stems from this. About the CDTA, what is the impact? After exchanging information, will it help us with dealing with double taxation? Thank you, Mr. Leung Kwok-hong. Well, to enhance Hong Kong's competitiveness, so that Hong Kong enterprises can enjoy an edge in terms of calculation of taxation and prevention of double taxation when dealing with other businesses overseas. We have been striving to sign more CDTAs with other jurisdictions, and so far we have signed such agreements with 37 jurisdictions. So for residents in both jurisdictions, in terms of taxation assessment for residents in these jurisdictions, definitely the agreements help. In terms of the AEOI, for those who are tax residents in another jurisdiction and who earns an income and holds some assets in other jurisdictions, we can have further information. And we have international standards that requires a regular exchange of information with other jurisdictions. How about if local enterprises and individuals invest in another jurisdiction? Will he be required to pay tax? Well, we adopt a terrestrial approach in our tax regime in Hong Kong. So for the profits generated locally, they will be they will be taxable, and for activities held outside the jurisdiction, they will not be taxable locally. So that's nothing to do with aligning with international standards. We'll be losing tax revenue, because if we make any profit in the U.S., they won't be required to pay tax in Hong Kong.
I asked this question a long time ago. Why don't we align with overseas practice? If the Hong Kong people earn money in Belgium and the U.S., why don't we tax them? Why don't we help Hong Kong people? We're now talking about universal pension. If you can collect taxes from overseas, that would solve the problem immediately. Have you not considered this? You can. Well, Mr. Leung Kwok-hong's suggestion involves a fundamental change in our tax regime. If we were to consider this, the society needs to discuss that. I understand. You say you need to comply with the OECD, you have to follow this, follow that. Why can't you follow Hong Kong's best interest? Well, why do you have to comply with the OECD interests? As we heard, Hong Kong bankers are screaming bloody murder. So, are you working for Hong Kong or OECD? Or are you selectively working for Hong Kong interests? Your time's up, Mr. Leung. Next. I also need to go to the washroom. Mr. Chan Ji-chun. Thank you, Chairman. I understand creating this post is to satisfy international tax requirements, and we also need to update our laws. My first question was Hong Kong's standing in the global regime. Are we falling behind? Are we average? How do we? And just now, Ms. Regina, you asked how we compare with Singapore. What about Taiwan, Korea, South Korea? How are we doing? Because previously, when we discussed the copyright ordinance, Mr. Greg So said we were in the Stone Age. Our international, we are not living up to international standards. We are on the observation list. We are so in. What's our status? We heard that we are falling behind Singapore. Why is this happening? Is it because of legislation? You haven't even drafted the bill. Well, once you draft it and it becomes endorsed, there's a time process. Could you tell us why we're falling behind? Secretary, thank you for the question regarding the automatic exchange of financial account information. We have to thank the last LegCo. They endorsed the bill. It gives us a framework to implement the plan. Honestly speaking, I had also answered the chair lady in the automatic exchange. How is Hong Kong's status? Honestly speaking, we are falling behind, and that is the OECD's comment about us. Why do we have such a situation? Well, just now a few legislators asked, when we participate in these international conventions, are we considering Hong Kong's interest? I can tell you definitely yes. So when we implement automatic exchange of account information, we are slightly different from the mainstream. For example, the international financial institutions, they require all the citizens' tax information should be collected and for exchange. But Hong Kong takes a focused approach. We only have bilateral tax information exchange before we collect the information. The second difference is internationally, 100 countries that are signatories to the agreement, over 90 of them participate in an international convention and use a similar mechanism to exchange information. But Hong Kong uses a special mechanism. We are not signatory to the convention. We use a bilateral agreement. We are negotiating individually. Why do we take this approach? We heard from LegCo and the industry that if we go too fast, the financial institutions' compliance costs would go up. Hong Kong's role as a financial hub might be affected. So after taking on board different views, Hong Kong's implementation is unique, and that explains why we're slow. But at this point, OECD feels that our approach isn't that ideal. They want us to accelerate, otherwise they'll blacklist us. So at this point, we need to step up our pace. I also need to leave this venue at 11:30 to participate in Bill's committee on automatic exchange of financial account information. We need to move to prevent us being blacklisted. So you have to understand we do have a heavy workload, and we would like your support in creating this permanent post to maintain Hong Kong's role as a financial hub. I understand the Secretary is working very hard. It's not ideal to have 2 meetings overlapping. Of course, if you comply and do everything, that would be the simplest method, but we need to have a tailor-made approach, and we should do the least and minimal we should do the least work and try to get the maximum outcome. So do we end up being an uncooperative tax zone? Will we have actual losses, or could you have a brief response because he needs to leave? Well, our consideration is very practical, like Mr. Chan. I said just now, this automatic exchange of financial information, 100 countries are signatories and 90 of them have signed bilateral agreements they can exchange information. Hong Kong is one of the less than 10 countries or jurisdictions that use a bilateral approach. So under this consideration, if a lot of people can't do it, then our concern is minimal. Well, we also need to consider if people blacklist us, or they, what is the probability of having punitive measures? Is this a bluff, or do we have any grace period? Well, regarding specific punitive measures, we don't know. Have any other jurisdictions been penalized? Well, this was an initiative dating back to 2014. Well, we don't want to take a gamble. Mr. Fernando Chung? Thank you, Chairman. This post will help us comply with international tax information exchange regulations. Well, that's important, and we would like to target asset transfers in order to evade tax. Well, is Hong Kong a tax haven, or as the Secretary says, Hong Kong will it be blacklisted? We are worried because internationally there's a lot of information. There's a tax justice network. Hong Kong is listed as the second tax haven. The Panama Papers, when they were leaked, it was a big shock. It indicates that Hong Kong intermediaries assist consortiums of politicians and rich people to register some Panamanian offshore companies, and we are number one out of the intermediaries in Panama setting up offshore companies. Hong Kong is number one, so it is a matter of concern. The Secretary said we have pledged to implement the Common Reporting Standard under the OECD, but according to the Tax Justice Network, on one hand, we pledge to accept and implement these measures, but we refuse to sign a multilateral competent agreement. So this MCAA, there are now 85 jurisdictions, signatories, where they automatically exchange this information. But we have not become signatories, but instead we take a bilateral approach. We have signed up 11 bilateral agreements. This is time consuming, and we need to negotiate individually. So it's obvious it's a slow process. We also take a position of voluntary secrecy. That means if we don't want to collect other parties' information, so we can exchange with bilateral agreement countries. So the common reporting standard under the OECD, we don't want to collect other jurisdictions' information. So I want to ask, why are we not a signatory to MCAA, and why do we take this voluntary secrecy approach? We will provide information, but we don't collect information. Why do we have this approach? Because if we want to be transparent and target tax evasion, why do we have this arrangement? Thank you for the 2 questions. Hong Kong is definitely not a tax haven. Our tax regime is simple, transparent, and clear. This is our advantage. We will maintain this advantage. Hong Kong tax base and tax categories are simpler, but it doesn't mean we are a tax haven. Under the tax ordinance, the Inland Revenue will ensure that taxpayers and corporations will pay their taxes. That's but as an international finance center, there's a lot of financial intermediary activities. That's a fact. Intermediary activities and tax haven, they are not. There's no correlation. And second, Mr. Zhang mentioned that in the automatic exchange of information, as I explained, in the last couple of years, when we drafted the framework before it was endorsed by LegCo, we heard from LegCo and the finance industry. When the SAR government undertakes this task, they want us to not go so fast. So we've taken a unique approach. We sign bilateral agreements with tax jurisdictions before exchanging. Unlike 80-90 countries where they signed multilateral convention, the latter will speed up information exchange. Our approach is slow, so that was the consideration of Hong Kong's interest. But up till this point, OECD feels that we're going too slow. We only signed 11 bilateral agreements, and compared to the rest of the world where they hope to have information exchange by next year, we are falling behind. So at this point, we need to consider whether we should sign up with the multilateral arrangement. So we have some fine-tuning considerations. He hasn't answered about voluntary secrecy. Well, we will collect other parties' information. Hong Kong regime is territorial. So Hong Kong companies in Canada or UK, if they made a lot of money, it has no impact on our tax collection. That's a fact. Mr. Yu Chong Yim, I want to ask IRD the supernumerary posts, because in paragraph 20 it says conveyance workload is going up and the number of transactions are going up, but in fact it's coming down. The document refers to 98,000 cases, but if you refer to 2011, it was 160,000, and in 2012 it was 120,000. It has actually fallen by 40%. Well, but I am very understanding. You are affected by the SSD double sales arrangement. We are now handling the special stamp duty bill, and it might not be endorsed, so you might not be able to release this workload. So shouldn't you maintain the supernumerary post until that bill is endorsed? Because if it has been endorsed, it might be amended again. So we don't know when it will be endorsed. So will you consider maintaining the supernumerary post? So you might not need to make it a permanent post. You could just add a supernumerary post. Thank you for the question. Mr. Hughes has a very acute observation. You need to understand that we're taking a supernumerary position and converting it into a permanent post. The work is not just limited to stamp duty. Even if you look at stamp duty in real estate, Mr. Yu's analysis is correct. Compared to the peak, the transactions have come down. But aside from quantity, we also need to deal with quality. Mr. Yu pointed out in recent years, the government has implemented housing supply management. Before Easter, there has been work done regarding a purchase of multiple units in one contract. So we need to understand that aside from quantity, we also have a lot of complexities that we need to deal with. So it's a challenge to our colleagues. We need to understand the permanent post is not just dealing with conveyancing tax. If you look at paragraph 23, we have to consider whether a supernumerary post is appropriate. In the past, the stamp duty department, aside from dealing with real estate tax, they also have to deal with stamp duty arising from the China-Hong Kong stock through train. Last year, the LegCo endorsed the real estate transaction authority that they will charge a levy. So we need the IRD to deal with the extra workload, and all this work is ongoing, and we are very restrained. We feel that there is a large need for a permanent post. I just want to point out that adding a supernumerary post would be better than converting it to permanent post, because a lot of work is just short term. Even Basel III, it's a short-term project. Stamp duty, if it cannot be endorsed, then all the complex work will be released. We might need to help the real estate authority. That is just an additional short-term work. If you don't have sufficient manpower, you could just add a supernumerary post. That would be more appropriate than converting it into a permanent post. We understand your opinion. When we considered the case, we were very restrained. First of all, the supernumerary post, initially it was endorsed in 2014. It was a 3-year supernumerary post. So we look at it very carefully. Will the work be cyclical, seasonal? So I said in the beginning, having a 3-year supernumerary post.
After 3 years of experience, we feel that the workload has increased, and the work of the IRD or the other units of the IRD have seen an increase in workload. So I hope you understand that for this fiscal year, the overall revenue, general revenue, is $540 billion. A large portion is from stamp duty. So this chief assessor will have to manage tax revenue up to $90 billion. So I hope you understand that we need extra resources in order to do a good job. Mr. Jeremy Tam, first round. Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to ask about the chief assessor working in the stamp duty unit. So there is a job description for this chief assessor. and he will have to provide, supervise and plan, and he has to deal with cases of a report of evasion of stamp duty. After investigation, will you inform or will you relate the finding to the informant? Can you tell us what will be the procedures? Thank you. Mr. Tam. First, I have to apologize because I have to leave at 11:30 for another meeting. So I will invite Mr. Tam from the IRD to take this question. When we receive a complaint, of course, we will follow up and see whether we have information to follow up. As regards whether the complainant or informant will be informed of our application, of our investigation, we'll see whether personal privacy is compromised. So we will usually not relate the findings to the complainant. But of course, if the complainant is involved in a stamp duty case, then depending on the merits of the case, we will communicate with the complainant. Now for general complaints, whether it be the couple or IPCC, if you complain a case to the relevant authorities, you'll be informed of the progress of investigation and possible follow-up action. Of course, you cannot compromise personal privacy of the persons concerned, but other government departments are still doing that. So how will you tell the informant the findings? How come you will not tell the informant the outcome of investigation? It's not that, of course, we will inform the informer that we have received the complaint, and how much will be disclosed will depend on the circumstances of the case. Who decide how much will be revealed to the informer? Yes, who will consider whether the privacy of a third party will be compromised. The reason I asked this question is I was once an informer. Possible evasion of tax of stamp duty in a case involving a whole block. When a developer wants to resume a building for redevelopment, assuming that the flat is worth $5 million, the usual practice is to just give the flat owner $3.5 million, and the rest $1.5 million will be ex gratia payment. And that is because the stamp duty is levied on the basis of that $3.5 million. I gave you a copy of the check for $1.5 million and $3.5 million. I don't know whether Mr. Chen was present. I went to the IRD directly. I complained the case to your commissioner, asking you to follow up to see whether there was any breach of relevant legislation. I asked you to get back to me, and of course you didn't. I asked her whether there was any outcome, and the reply was whether the investigation was complete or not could not be relayed to me. Of course, you don't have to tell me the actual particulars and the money involved and whether the case involved all the units in the building, but at least you should tell me whether the investigation is complete and whether any follow-up action has been taken after investigation, or whether the cases are not substantiated. I expected that much, but you refused to tell me. As an informer, I put the case to you because I saw injustice in that, and it's strange that you wouldn't even tell me whether investigation was done. The Commissioner, well, I cannot comment on individual cases, but if investigation is still ongoing, I believe it is inappropriate to disclose anything to the informer. If the outcome is available, the extent of information we can disclose will depend on the circumstances of the case. Regarding the case referred to by Mr. Tam, I can check with my colleagues, but it is appropriate for us to comment on that now. Mr. James So, I apologize. I was chairing a meeting next door on electoral matters. Although what I want to say is not directly relevant to what Mr. Tam said. Now, you said that when you are carrying out investigation, you cannot disclose details, but you wouldn't even tell Mr. Tam whether there was any investigation. You may feel that you are investigating a case, but then the informer didn't know. So there's something wrong with the supervision or the monitoring. I'm not just targeting at IRD. I think there are something about the SFC. SFC cannot tell you whether an investigation is in progress. Well, even for ICAC, it has very strict secrecy code, but it doesn't have this practice. So I like to make public my view on this matter to the IRD and also other public bodies. When we considered legislation on exchange of tax information, I think a question was asked by, not by me, but by another member. We're told that the workload would not be too much. At least, now, when you have two boxes, whether it is a big or small, well, we're told that they were not prepared for spate of inquiries. We understand back then people had higher tax rates, we had lower rates, and of course there would be some follow-up. At least my impression was I would pay attention to that point. The impression I got was the workload wouldn't be too much. Now you want to create a post, a directorate post, quite a senior post to handle this. Should the administration reconsider whether the workload is really going to be that much? Because with exchange, requests for exchange in information, you will gradually see the inquiries coming in, and people will ask when there is a need. Given that the IRD is of a considerable scale, can you use internal deployment of resources to try to cope for a year or so first? Well, if in the first year or 9 months there are indeed a flood of inquiries, you can immediately create a post to handle that. So to deal with anticipated new duties, yes, I agree that there will be more work for the department to do, but will it be more will it be safer if you handle such new duties in this way? Yes, Mr. To is correct. At first, we considered whether we'll be able to cope with a new workload arising from such matters. Now in 2014, or starting from 2014, on automatic exchange of information, there were already new standards, and then in 2015 we had that requirement, automatic exchange of financial account information, and then we also have BEPS, that is base erosion and profit shifting, and then there were new international measures, and in June 2016, just last year, as explained by the Deputy Secretary, we didn't really have a choice. We made clear that we would implement the whole BEPS measure. Well, there are 4 basic standards under BEPS. For legislation under preparation, and OECD and EU have new measures on cooperation on tax matters, and for BEPS we intend to implement the 4 minimum requirements, but we can expect that in the very near future they'll continue to ask other tax jurisdictions to implement other standards. So we won't underestimate the workload associated. So when these measures first crop up, we tried to absorb the new workload using existing manpower. But as Mr. To said, 2 or 3 years have elapsed, and we can envisage a continued increase in workload. So if we can have a dedicated directorate officer to oversee the policy formulation work, we believe it will be more desirable. Second round, myself. My question is very simple, and that is bilateral agreement on tax information exchange. You have agreement with 11 countries. What are they? Belgium, Canada, Kansai, Italy, Mexico, Portugal, and South Africa. All right. Just for my information, perhaps I missed that. I have don't have other questions. I wanted to ask how come it's bilateral instead of multilateral, and that question has already been answered. Mr. Ray Chen, according to the paper, this post is a permanent post, and for the duties of the PAS, most of it is on legislation. Enclosure 1, the first duty, policy and legislative matters for tax treaties between Hong Kong and other jurisdictions. I'd like to know how long will the legislative exercise take? 1, 2, 3, and 6 are legislative duties. I'd like to know whether you have a timetable for such duties, and once the legislation is enacted, will there be a marked drop in workload for this post? Usually for legislative exercise, a supernumerary post may be created, and usually the post would lapse after the legislative work is done. Thank you. Mr. Chen is very correct. This new PAS post will have a lot to do with policy and legislative matters. For instance, legislation on BEPS. To implement the measures, we want to legislate on the 4 minimum standards. We are now preparing for introduction of the bill to the Council in the second half of this year. And for automatic exchange of information, as explained, just last June, we passed an amendment bill to set up a legal framework for us to do that. And just today, we have another Bills Committee in operation. For another round of amendments, we plan to adopt a gradual approach after we have concluded an agreement on exchange of information. We will amend the bill to include that country. But OECD's demand on all tax jurisdictions are increasing very rapidly. So, and all of a sudden, from 2, the number of jurisdictions has increased to 74. Such developments are very rapid. And we've been using a multilateral approach for exchange of information. We're now reviewing this because of a rapid change in global trend, and if after the review is decided to amend the approach, legislative work is required. So in the coming couple of years, we'll have a lot of bills for introduction to the Council. You may say that after this is done, that is fine, but as I explained, we are planning to do the 4 minimum standards under BEPS, but we can envisage that in the very near future, we may be required to attain other standards. So we expect a sustained increase in workload. I hope members understand that all this aims to ensure that Hong Kong will not be blacklisted as an uncooperative area that may affect our free trade and other things. I think the PS has been rather general in her reply. Yes, I support such legislative work. My question is, what is the timetable for the 4 duties outlined in Enclosure 1? And I think the answer hasn't been too specific. Do you agree with me, Chairman? As explained, in the second half of this year, we'll have a bill on BEPS, and then just today, we're examining a bill on automatic exchange of information. And if we change our multilateral approach, we have to amend the legislation. And for BEPS, we are introducing 4 minimum standards, but we may have to further amend the legislation if more standards have to be introduced, and that involves a number of bills to be introduced to the Council. Mr. Jeremy Tam, second round. I'd like to follow up on Mr. Tam's reply on operation of the IRD. As Mr. James Teo said, when ICAC receives a complaint, it will at least tell the complainant or informer whether a case will be investigated, or investigation is completed, or is unsubstantiated. And if it is the first case, then the follow-up actions taken, such as prosecution, or the conclusion is the case is not substantiated. So why can't IRD at least tell us whether the case is substantiated, whether investigation is going on or completed? I don't see how privacy can be compromised, because it's just a simple matter. Why do we have to discuss it here? Why can't you follow the relatively high threshold or standard set by ICAC in this regard? How come IRD is not using the same approach as ICAC?
Mr. Tam. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Tam, for your question. I think I cannot comment on the practice of another department, but when we carry out our duty, we need to observe the relevant laws and regulations, and we have the secrecy provision in the IRO. Any complaint or information relate to us in relation to the IRO will not be disclosed. We'll only inform the complainant that we will duly follow up on the matter. As for the stamp duty case, we need to consider the facts of the case. I will only try to avoid disclosing unnecessary information, and whilst informing the complainant that we are handling the case. Mr. Tam might be referring to that specific case, and perhaps I'll go back and see how we can address your concern. I don't want to get in your, waste everybody's time. I think I will liaise with you on that specific case, but in general, I don't think that you should just tell a counselor that this is the way you handle the case. Of course, putting aside whether there is any unscrupulous motive, you should still consider whether the complaint is substantiated and whether you will proceed with investigation and take action. If a complaint is made and then it's just empty talk without any action, then if there is another suspected case of tax evasion, people will think that it is pointless to tell the IRD because they are not going to take up the case. I think that for the chief assessor, one of his duties will be to formulate guidelines and give replies to the inquiries of cases, and that's the comment I wish to make. Mr. Leung Kwok-hong. Madam Chair, they talked about the confidentiality clause in the IRO, and that is why the complainant cannot be told whether their complaint will be investigated. I think this is unreasonable. The complainant and the person being complained should be informed, because under the IRO, the complainant will not get any information protected by the confidentiality clause in the IRO. Is it fair to say that? Well, I understand that you need to be the gatekeeper or nobody will file their tax returns. Section 4 of the IRO clearly provides that we are not allowed to disclose any tax information to any person other than the person concerned or the authorized representative. But the person did not tell you that he is the subject of the complaint, so the information doesn't come from that person being complained. Of course, you shouldn't tell the complainant whether a third party has also lodged the complaint. This is just the logic. I wish to point out that if we receive a complainant, we will inform the complainant that we have received a complaint, and in fact we will follow up on all the complaints, but we cannot disclose any information relating to that taxpayer. Now, of course, even the chairman of the League of Social Democrats is being sued, but using the logic of the ICAC, let's say there is a complainant, and then the complainant asks about the progress of the complaint being made 3 months ago, and then you will tell the complainant that no information can be provided because the person being complained of is protected by the confidentiality clause in the IRO. But I don't think that the information provided by the complainant should be subject to the provision, because the information relates to what has happened. So why can't you follow the ICAC's practice and adopt their logic. If it's not logical, then it won't do. We studied mathematics in the traditional way. Well, if we don't revise geometry properly, then the teacher would just put a big cross on the homework and ask us to redo it. So, about the complainant and the person being complained, whether the complaint is substantiated or not, why can't you give this information? What is the problem? For the ICAC, the logic could be that the complainant must not be the person being complained must not be told, or he would flee. Well, using that example, if A complains against B about something, then whether the complaint against B is substantiated or not, and whether the B has committed a wrong under the IRO should be kept confidential. As far as my understanding of the provision in the IRO is concerned, what's the point of keeping it a secret? If the complainant asks about the progress of investigation, what has it to do with the person protected by the IRO? Because at that time when the complaint was made, there was no such information. Anything to add, Mr. Tam? Let me repeat that Section 4 of the IROs provides that any officer dealing with the case concerning any information relating to the person being complained of should be kept confidential. Dr. Fernando Zhang. Well, just now the DS mentioned that in the past we exchanged information on tax matters and financial matters on a bilateral basis. But according to the paper, because of pressure from the international organization, there is a need for the government to monitor the latest development and devise the appropriate response and strategy on the proposal to exchange information on the multilateral basis. So the government will consider signing an MCAA. I want to know what your consideration is. When will it be done? And in the incident of the Panama Papers, although HSBC is a British bank, it is the largest bank in Hong Kong. It helps the setting up of 2,300 odd offshore companies, according to the Panama Papers, accounting for 15% of all the offshore companies. So, in terms of tax avoidance, the major banks in Hong Kong play a major role. Of course, the offshore companies set up by intermediaries account for the largest number of offshore companies in the world, according to Panama Papers. So I'm concerned about the transparency of information, and also, of course, you're trying to enhance transparency to combat tax avoidance. At the same time, intermediaries and even major banks will be going against your effort. So, do you have any measure to tackle that? Because on the one hand, you suggest that we are an international financial center and we have to abide by international standards and implement international treaties. At the same time, we have major banks and intermediaries combating your effort for the sake of their own profit. Do you have any responsive strategy to tackle that? I think the paper has already explained that in terms of international tax cooperation developments, the purpose is to exactly combat tax evasion And in terms of the automatic exchange of information on tax matters, we follow the OECD's requirement, and the organization has given a lot of thought of the matter. Last June, we submitted a bill which set out the framework. And like I said, today we have another bill which will be examined, and the bill relates to reportable jurisdictions, and the tax residents in these jurisdictions will be required to provide information. And this is again one of the OECD's requirements. As mentioned just now, we adopt a bilateral arrangement at present, and Dr. Zhang asked when the arrangement will be changed, and like the paper suggests, we'll keep a close watch on the latest development and map out our strategy and response in due course. We also have close liaison with the OECD. We closely monitor the latest development in the EU. I think your answer is too vague. Do you have any indicators to gauge when we should sign multilateral agreements as the benchmark? I think at present we're unable to give you a timetable, but we do have regular liaison with the OECD, and we will closely monitor the latest developments. For international taxation meetings, there are lots of them, and we will keep in view the latest developments and map out our strategy and response in a timely manner. Mr. Eddie Ju, first round, I have 2 questions. First, on the AEOI. Just now I heard that it was done on a bilateral basis in the past. Well, according to international experience, how long does it take? Thank you, Mr. Zhu. I can give you some information. We have been making much progress in last year, because we only formulated the legal framework in June last year, and we only signed 2 CAAs with Japan and the UK in the end of last year. But like what we reported just now, so far we've signed agreements with 11 jurisdictions. So in the past few months, we have been able to sign 9 agreements, and we are still making progress. So about the workload required in the negotiation process, if we adopt a multilateral approach, does it mean that we can save a lot of resources, manpower, and time for negotiation? You can put it this way, because we don't need to go through the each and every jurisdiction if we adopt a multilateral approach. Any member of the OECD who wishes to exchange information can just join. Then will this be your consideration? Of course, the government has its own ideas. Why, instead of taking a multilateral approach, the government will rather go through each and every agreement with the jurisdictions concerned? And I think the purpose of creating the post is to take part in the multilateral negotiation. I think it's set out in the paper. Frontline support will be provided by colleagues in the IRD. As far as the FSTB is concerned, we need policy support and also take on follow-up work after the legislation has been enacted. But even if the bilateral approach is not taken, in the paper, we've already touched on issues apart from the AOEI, such as new international initiatives. We need the officers to formulate the relevant laws and policies. Madam Chair, just now Dr. Fernando Zhang asked about intermediary companies in Hong Kong helping to set up offshore companies. And according to the PS, it is suggested that setting up offshore companies is not equivalent to labeling Hong Kong as a tax haven. But we have seen a lot of examples, as revealed in the Panama Papers, even former government officials, tycoons, they have set up offshore companies to handle their assets or businesses. If it goes offshore, then we can't do anything about it. If it's done locally, however, after joining the multilateral or bilateral agreements, is there any way to target these cases in which people make use of offshore companies to handle the taxable profit or income made locally, which the IRD is unable to collect? Is there any way to plug this loophole? I want to emphasize that Hong Kong has a terrestrial taxation system, and profit generated in Hong Kong is taxable. For profits generated elsewhere, well, Madam Chair, I understand, but let's say if somebody holds some shares in another jurisdiction, the business, however, is carried out in Hong Kong, so the profit is still generated locally. But at present, they are not taxable in Hong Kong because they're able to hide their identity by holding shares of an offshore company. So under the agreements signed bilaterally or multilaterally, how can we collect tax from them? There are a number of international tax cooperation initiatives, such as BEPS, base erosion, and profit shifting of enterprises. I don't think I wonder if the member is referring to this situation. The OECD has also proposed 15 initiatives in an action plan. That is to align ourselves with the international tax standards, and there are also minimum standards under BEPS. And Hong Kong, along with 90+ jurisdictions, are associates under this framework. So in terms of international tax cooperation initiative, we are joining hands to combat tax evasion. Dr. Edward Yiu, second round. Thank you, Madam Chair. In paragraph 10 of the paper, apart from, say, implementing measures to tackle BEPS, you still need to go through individual agreements because some partners may not follow the BEPS requirements. Does it mean that this new officer will need to take up additional work?
And in the future, under BEPS, they also have to deal with multilateral agreements. Well, paragraph 10 refers to something else. It's the comprehensive avoidance of double taxation agreements. So we want to reduce or avoid double taxation, and that is the CDTA. And another workload is the exchange of account information. This is something the OECD requires us to do, so you can look at it separately. The exchange of account information the jurisdictions interested in exchanging information with Hong Kong, whether it's through a bilateral or multilateral arrangement, such that we can provide overseas citizens tax information generated in Hong Kong to the other jurisdiction, compared to comprehensive avoidance of double taxation. We just want to prevent some people paying tax in Hong Kong and not paying as much tax in their another jurisdiction. That is a separate issue. We talked about BEPS. That is another OECD recent tax arrangement requirement. So does that mean there are three jobs? We have ABC, BEPS, CDTA, and AEOI. Okay, I understand. So I want to ask, they are discussing a bill in the next door. I don't understand. The bill should be endorsed and then there should be a supernumerary post, or do we have the supernumerary post and then whether we have to see whether the bill is endorsed? So it seems that that bill will only affect one item out of three, and even without the bill, there are two areas that will still involve that workload. Well, the bill next door is the AEOI. That's the automatic exchange of information that we have to, regarding these jurisdictions, we have to exchange information. So that's one of the areas. We also have BEPS, the base erosion and profit shifting. That has to be dealt with by legislation. So how do you manage the timetable? You create a supernumerary post, but the legislation is not endorsed. Well, in the room next door, they are handling a bill. The Finance and Treasury Bureau, the Revenue Post, they have been dealing with tax issues, and we are working under this heavy workload, and these are new tax arrangements arising in the last 2-3 years. So does that mean if the bill cannot be endorsed, we don't need this post? You cannot say that, because regarding international tax arrangements, the PS had mentioned that we have to comply with international requirements, and we do urge members to support us. We still have a lot of bills to deal with that, and if the bill is not endorsed, we have to come up with new ideas to deal with this. Okay, we have 15 minutes left. We run to 12:45. Okay, we still have Tan Ji-chun and Ju Hoi-dik. Who else? Because we have another meeting at 8:30 tomorrow. Yu Chong Yin, Mr. Dr. Fernando Zhang. Do you have any questions? Leung Kok-hong. The third round for Leung Kok-hong. So we have 5 members. Let's see if we can handle this item today. And we have Mr. Ju Hoi-dik. I'd like to ask the officials BEPS, there are some 10+ action plans to deal with the intermediaries, setting up offshore companies issues that I'm referred to. the cross-border the lists, I see there are some 80 plus listed on the website, including countries, offshore companies that Hong Kong people are familiar with, the British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands. So I want to ask if Hong Kong participates in the MCAA, Information Exchange Network, then we can liaise directly with the Cayman Islands BVI to exchange this type of tax information, such that the wealthy people in Hong Kong or influential people cannot use these offshore companies to avoid Hong Kong taxes. I think we're talking about two things. First, you were referring to BEPS, and the second thing, you refer to the AEOI. We have to look at it separately. We are using a bilateral, and whether we will use the multilateral approach on automatic exchange of information. Under our tax regime, we have a schedule listing reportable jurisdictions, and this is exactly what is being discussed in a separate venue in a Bills Committee meeting. So the financial institutions, they have to provide the information of those individuals in the list. They have to provide their tax information, and that is an automatic exchange of information. That is one issue. And just now you were referring to a website, the BEPS. In paragraph 6 we have mentioned that there are some 90 plus different jurisdictions where they have a cooperation framework, and Hong Kong has pledged that we will implement BEPS. And if you look at paragraph 7, we say that regarding BEPS there are 4 minimum requirements. We have to put in place the spontaneous exchange of information on tax rulings, country by country reporting requirement, cross-border dispute resolution, and so on. It sounds like a lot, but this was an initiative led by the OECD, and it deals with different areas such as AEOI is the exchange of account information. BEPS, I talked about base erosion and profit shifting. So it's quite complex. Chairman, my suggestion is simple. I understand the system is complex. There are many areas, but the thrust of my question is, if we could sign a multilateral agreement, in one go we could exchange information with a lot of countries, including the notorious offshore havens. So will it help the Hong Kong government in collecting tax? Will we see an improvement? The banking sector or finance sector might feel that they'll do a lot less business, but when you compare the two, joining these agreements as soon as possible and sharing with many jurisdictions might be more beneficial to the Hong Kong public. Mission is two separate issues. We are aware of the AEOI. If we don't use a multilateral, can we step up the exchange of information? We need to emphasize Hong Kong uses a territorial approach, and profits generated overseas, we cannot, it's not taxable. Mr. Tan Ji-chun, third round. We don't have a quorum, but I'll still ask. I'm not sure if you can vote on it. I want to ask about the general assessor post. It's a permanent post. I'd like the government to explain why it has to be a permanent post. This is related to the stamp duty. We understand they will focus on real estate stamp duty, the double stamp duty, but the Secretary said that it's not limited to that. So, real estate stamp duty, how much of that workload does it make up? In paragraph 21, we see there's a surge in appeals. I won't read out the details. So what type of stamp duty is that? And if my understanding is correct, if you deal with a lot of double stamp duty, special stamp duty from real estate, but that should not be a mainstream arrangement. We have I support that, but the pro-establishment camp is against that, and it should be withdrawn as soon as the market returns to normality. But it now seems that the special stamp duty is a permanent arrangement. Mr. Tam, thank you, Mr. Chan, for your question. Actually, we have a stamp duty, a special stamp duty, but the stamp duty division is not just dealing with the issues arising from the special stamp duty. As we heard, they deal with appeal cases, and appeal cases are dealt with by the courts. If you look at the appeal cases, even before the so-called SSDs, we had appeals, but in recent years it has surged rapidly. But these weren't appeals arising from SSD. Our analysis is that by the end of March this year, we have some cases outstanding, and 20% of them are related to the SSD. The rest are, even if it weren't involved in SSD, these are still appeals that we have to deal with. So I want to mention in paragraph 23, we have some measures related to SSD. It might not look like recurring, but they do appear from time to time. There will always be new cases. And I want to mention that SSD is our third division. We have more than 600 staff members. If we don't have the stamp duty assessor, then we only have one chief assessor. So compared to 600 staff, it's a 20% of our establishment. So the chief assessor has to oversee stamp duty, a very specialized area. It's a very heavy workload and might affect work quality. So conveyance, how much does it make up the stamp duty division? I need time to get that information. Well, can you convey a message to society? Well, SSD is a policy determined by the Bureau. The message we receive, it's not going to be a permanent arrangement, but whether we have SSD or not, our workload has been increasing over the years. Dr. Fernando Zhang. I think the Panama Papers has highlighted a lot of problems aside from Hong Kong intermediaries and Hong Kong banks help politicians and rich people set up offshore accounts. The Panama Papers also indicate that out of the tens of thousands of offshore companies, actually it's 210,000 offshore companies, the majority of owners or directors are from China, and second place is Hong Kong. So it's almost common knowledge that this is money laundering for illicit funds, especially a lot of mainland money comes through Hong Kong and is laundered, and it becomes laundered funds. So we have been blacklisted for more than once on the uncooperative tax jurisdiction. I know in 2015 that had happened. So that indicates Hong Kong assists people to evade tax. And just now the Secretary denied that. Now this status, or this is something that we should deal with. We should allow tax information to circulate. We want to prevent politicians or rich people to hide information to evade tax. I want to ask the government, over the years we have failed. The Europe Commission has highlighted this. The Panama Papers disclosure has Hong Kong is top of the list as a tax evasion center. So if we still drag our feet and not sign up with the multilateral agreement, so how can this post help us? Are we going to drag our feet and very reluctantly, or are we just going to pay some lip service to the OECD and mission? We explained just now that starting from June last year, after setting up the legal framework for AEOI, even though we're handling the bilateral agreements individually, we already have 11 agreements. So aside from information exchange, there are other international tax measures, and whether it's OECD or the EU, how they assess jurisdiction as a non-cooperative tax regime. We look at how wide-reaching our network is, how fast we do our work, and whether Hong Kong has other tax measures where they feel it's inappropriate. The OECD and the EU will look into that. So this post indicates that regarding international tax cooperation, we really need to have a dedicated post, a director level post.
Because the new development has been moving very rapidly in the past couple of years. Yes, we have resources to look at tax policies for Hong Kong, but then we have to deal with other things. So we really need this post because we have a lot of related policy and legislative matters in progress or waiting to be attended to. So we really urge members to support us. Dr. Edward Yu, third round. Yes, I support the creation of the post. It's just that we're worried. There are many pieces of legislation are involved. And I don't think such legislation can be passed very easily. I'm a bit worried by the DS replies. Any undertaking or internet made to international organizations are not binding in Hong Kong unless we have got a domestic legislation to support it. So any undertaking or agreement is not binding on Hong Kong. So there is no question of passing a piece of legislation as a must once an agreement is passed. Otherwise, that means we are just a rubber stamp, and this is putting the cart before the horse. Yes, if you want to ensure our competitiveness, we have to take into account such agreements or undertakings. But then take the stamp duty or special stamp duty initiatives as an example. They are controversial. So I'd like to have the legislative timetable for the legislation you have in mind before we can judge when is the most appropriate time for the creation of the post. DS. PS. Dr. Yu said that we are now associate of an cooperation framework of BEPS. Yes, we need local legislation to underpin that. We do not treat LegCo as a rubber stamp. Just last October to December, we conducted a public consultation on BEPS to gauge the views of the industry. All these will be taken into account when it comes to the legislative details. So Dr. Yu is very correct. And what if legislation cannot be enacted successfully in Hong Kong? I think myself and also the PS has explained that if we do not introduce these standards, we are likely to be blacklisted as an uncooperative area. And what will be the consequence? According to EU's documents last year, for these uncooperative tax jurisdictions, their member states are talking about mutual sanctions, and that is very detrimental to the overall interests of Hong Kong. So for the sake of Hong Kong, we really need the support of the Council to achieve these international standards. Mr. Leung Kwok Hong, third round. I'm rather unhappy that rich men in Hong Kong have moved to tax havens to evade paying tax in Hong Kong, also evade paying taxes there. So our interest is undermined, and these rich people do not pay tax to countries where they have their investments. This is very saddening. Well, yes, the drug formulary should be reformed so as to save lives. I just took somebody to beg them to provide a certain type of drug to save a 70-odd-year-old man. And for stamp duty and also dividends that are interest-free, well, people are evading tax by moving overseas, and then we welcome other people to come to Hong Kong to avoid tax. I really agree that the post should be created ASAP so that these people can no longer avoid paying tax. For exchange of information, what about the personal gain or beneficiary? I beg your pardon, I didn't quite get the question. Not the corporate, not just the corporate interest, but the beneficiary owners of a company. The automatic exchange of information mechanism is such that we have a draft bill. We have a bill to increase the number of jurisdictions to 70 odd. And once the bill is passed, financial institutions in Hong Kong will have to collect information, and such information has to be submitted to IRD on an annual basis. But whatever somebody called CY Leung has got something overseas, we don't know, only you know. Now, if a client of an FI is is a tax citizen of another jurisdiction, for instance, we have a citizen in Hong Kong, and if he is not a citizen of another jurisdiction, then his information will not be covered. That means we cannot find out the truth. We do not have to pay global tax, and if you don't want to pay tax in Hong Kong, you go overseas. He set up another company in another jurisdiction. Will he be caught? Let me reiterate, with or without the mechanism for automatic exchange of information, we have a territorial-based system for taxation. Yes, I get that. People move from a low tax regime to even a lower tax regime. Of course, people won't be so stupid as to pay tax in the U.S. If the U.S. levy global tax, then of course you will suffer. But what if a person makes money in the U.S. and then channel his funds to Panama? So if somebody has moved to the U.S. and go to another tax haven, of course he would not come back to Hong Kong because that's too risky. And we don't know whether he has come back to Hong Kong. Is that feasible? Is that possible? If you can disclose the beneficiary owners of a company, then so that I can track them down, then it may be of use. If not, it's useless. For the automatic exchange of information, well, yes, we exchange information in tax matters with another jurisdiction. If the tax authorities of the local or of that jurisdiction has their own action, then they will act according to their own law. But for us, yes, I get that. That means an entrepreneur in Hong Kong doesn't have to pay tax in Hong Kong for money made outside Hong Kong. Is that correct? Yes. We have a territorial base of taxation. Mr. Leung, you have used up your time, and Mr. Holden Chow has round, but we are about to end our meeting. I think we have discussed for quite a while the AEOI Japan. We have signed an agreement with Japan and the UK, and I agree that we need more manpower to deal with this area of work. Now, there is mention of double taxation relief here. I know that the administration would like to conclude agreements with more countries. There are some examples quoted in the paper. I'd like to know whether there are more proactive plans to cover more countries after the post is created, because as far as I know, we have been negotiating with Brazil and Australia, and has there been any progress? Now for the comprehensive agreement referred to by Mr. Chow, we have already signed 37 agreements, 12 of which among the top 20 trading partners of Hong Kong. And this is of great use to for the promotion of flow of capital and talent. So we are now discussing with another 13 tax jurisdictions covering Finland, Germany, Italy, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Macedon. So we do understand that such agreements are very useful in promoting development of the economy. We have 4 minutes left. Can we proceed to a vote? I think so, because I am done with my questioning. You still have further questions, Dr. Fernando Joe? On the creation of this post, I urge the administration to sign the multilateral communication of MCAA ASAP. Switzerland has already done that because the Panama Papers exposed that Switzerland came second in helping people to set up companies, and Hong Kong topped the list. We know that for rich people who would like to hide their wealth, like to set up such companies. All right, we claim that we've already got agreements with 11 countries, whereas other jurisdictions have covered more than 100. So why can't we do that ASAP? Once the post is created, we should expedite we should expeditiously enhance the transparency of such matters. P.S. Can you consider doing that? As said in the paper, we are closely following the developments, and we will do. I'm afraid our time is up for our meeting. Can you come back at 8:30 tomorrow? Tomorrow, 8:30 a.m. Thank you. Speakers off mic. What about food and health? You want to vote on it separately? Of course, you can always ask for that. All right. Meeting adjourned. We will meet again at 8:30 a.m. tomorrow.